Hey everybody, I'm Anthony Johnson. I'm here to show you some of the features that are coming in the 21.1 release associated with the AGV process flow template. So we've seen a lot of the questions on our answer site are associated with the process flow template. Originally, when we released the AGV process flow template, it was meant both as feature-rich functionality for AGVs, but it was also intended as a starting point. What we found out, though, is over time, a lot of people are somewhat skittish in changing the process flow template because there's so much involved in it. Sometimes people can be a little bit intimidated by it, and so they just want to, use the process flow template, make the connections that are needed, but then when something, comes up that perhaps the process flow template doesn't cover, they're a little bit skittish to try and adjust the process flow template to their needs. With that in mind, what we've done in 21.1 is to split out the AGV process flow template into multiple different process flows that incrementally progress in their complexity and in their sophistication. So if you go to the process flow menu, you'll see instead of just a single AGV process flow template, you'll see 5. And each one of these progresses in sophistication. The basic AGV is the most simple one, and then we have an AGV with work forwarding, AGV with basic parking, AGV with heuristic parking, and then advanced AGV. The advanced AGV essentially has all of the features that the previous process flow template had, but these other ones are more simple. The idea being that a user can begin with the simplest process flow that has the features that they need, and then can take that and add new features on to a more simple process flow that hopefully they can be more confident in mastering and then adjusting. So here I'm going to go through each one of these templates and kind of describe exactly what that template is doing. So I'm going to start with the basic AGV. The basic AGV is about as simple as you can get. You have a main control loop. This is where each AGV will essentially repeatedly go through this loop. And what they are doing is going through what we call a next work point loop. Now I should say we have in 21.1, we changed the default naming of some of the AGV connections so that they hopefully will be a little bit more intuitive. If you go to the toolbox and if I double click on my AGV network and go to control point connections, we've renamed 2 of the connections. Before we used to call it a next look for work. We've changed that name to next work point. So instead of a look for work loop, we're calling it just a work point loop, which is you have different work points in a loop that you go around and you check for if there is work at that work point. And then what used to be the look for work connection, we are now calling the work forwarding connection. So in this connection, you forward your work from the location where the item is to be picked up to a location where an AGV can see it. And so we call that work forwarding. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. In this basic AGV process flow template, we just use the next work point connection. And the idea is that you create a loop of these connections, of these next work point connections, and then the process flow will cause the AGVs to go around in that loop to each point in that loop and check for work there. Now let me first, before I create this loop, I guess the first thing you do when you add an AGV process flow template is you add the template and then you connect the AGVs to that template. So I'm going to right click on an AGV, I go to process flow, and I check this box AGV, and that will connect that object to that process flow template. It will make it essentially an instance of that process flow. I'm going to do that for that same thing for this AGV. Now, once we do that, I'm just going to take you first through this work generation section. This section right here is kind of the section that is common across all of the process flows. And the idea is you have a work list, and when you want AGVs to pick up items, you push to that work list. So what I've done is for each one of these queues that receive from this source, you'll notice in my use transport, I've selected the option push to item list, and I choose AGV work. And then the next thing that I need to do is I need to make sure that the item has a destination label that is set to the destination where it needs to go. Okay. Now, once I've done that, then from that point on, the process flow takes over. Okay. And I'll show you how that works, what exactly it does. So I'm going to step through until an item enters a queue. Okay, so now we have an item that has entered this Q36. It has pushed that item onto this AGV work list. Now I'm going to show that AGV work list, view the entries on that list. Okay, so at the beginning of the simulation, what happens is I have one single process that starts. It does an acquisition of a single process, and anybody else coming through there just goes to a sink. This is just asserting that I get one process instead of a process for every single AGV that's attached to this process flow. But I get one process or one token that gets through this section. And what it essentially does is it repeatedly just pulls stuff off of this AGV work list. So this item has been pushed onto the list, but this token immediately pulled it off and then spawned a process to then sort that token into a location. Okay, this original token has now gone back onto this activity to then pull from this list again. So this token essentially just repeatedly pulls from that work list. Now, once it gets an item off of the work list, it then organizes that item into a partition. And so what it does is here it goes. If I hit step, it will, let's see, assign a control point to that item, and that's essentially what it does is it figures out what this control point is right here. So this is control point 33. So this assign CP figures out what this control point is, and then once it does that, it pushes the item back onto the AGV work list in the partition associated with that control point. Okay, so now you can see in my AGV work entries, I have a partition that is control point 33, and then that box is an entry on that partition. Okay, what this means is that now as my AGVs come around and they arrive at that location, they can essentially just pull from this partition, essentially the partition of the control point that they have arrived at. Once they pull from that partition, or at least once they're at that guy and they can pull from that partition, they can see all of the boxes. If there are multiple boxes, they can see all of the boxes in that partition. And then figuring out what work to do just becomes a matter of pulling from a list, which is something that, a natural thing that you can do in process flow. Okay, so Now that that has been pushed to that partition, let's look at this main control loop. So every AGV that is attached to this basic AGV process flow will, at the beginning of the simulation, it will initialize some data, and then it just goes into this main control loop, which is wherever it currently is, it wants to pull from that list. So it's pulling from this AGV work list, and it is pulling associated with the partition that is the current control point where the AGV is currently. Okay, so it pulls from that partition. If it finds something on that partition, then it'll essentially load the item, travel to the destination that that item needs to go to, and then unload the item, and then just jump back into this loop again. If it is at this point and there isn't something on that partition, then it will find the next work point to go in the work point loop, and it will travel to that work point and then do the same thing over again. And so what I can do now is, if I create a work point loop, so I connect from here to here, and I say next work point, and I do the same thing here, next work point, and I continually, let's see. All right, I create this loop. So essentially what's going to happen is this AGV, he'll start up, he'll check if there's something on that AGV work list partition for this control point, and he'll find nothing because there's nothing there. Then he'll pull from that next he'll get the next work point and then travel there and do the same thing. Now I should note that there is a feature that I'm piggybacking onto a feature of AGVs. If I go into my AGV network and go to control point connections, if I look at this next work point connection, I have this checkbox where I can make it into a list. Okay, so if checked, these connections will be added to a partitioned global list. Okay, so what this checkbox does, it essentially, when I've checked that box, then it will create a global list in my toolbox. So you can see here, this is my next work point global list. I can actually look at the entries of that work point list, and if I reset and run, you'll be able to see it puts everything onto that list. Okay, so if I am looking at, and each one of these is a partition, the partition represents the owner of the connection, and then the entries of a given partition represent the connections that owner has. So for example, if I'm looking at, this is control point 10, I can look at the partition, which is control point 10, and I can see that it has one entry, which is control point 33. So that's this guy, right? If I were to have two connections, okay, two next work point connections, and then if I reset and run, you'll see that this control point 10 will have two entries, control point 36 and control point 33, right? So I'm essentially, again, turning these connections into partitions of a list. And again, that makes it very easy to interact in process flow, because querying the connections of a control point essentially just becomes pulling from a list. Okay, and that's exactly what I'm doing, is when I don't have something to load, I pull from that next work point list, and the partition is, again, my current control point, and then I grab that off of the list. I then put it back onto the list. So I pull it off the list, I put it back onto the list, and then I travel to the next work point, and then I do the whole thing over again, right? So if I look at this AGV now, he checks, and now he's traveling to the next one. So this is AGV 1. So he's traveling to the next work point, and then he'll check. Once he's finished, he'll bump back on here. Now at this point, he's going to pull from this partition, and he'll see this item because remember we've pushed that item onto that partition. So he'll see that item, and then he'll now jump into this section where he loads the item, he travels to the destination, and then he unloads the item. And that's essentially what this basic AGV process flow does. I've gone through every single activity, so hopefully you guys, if you want to use this on your own, you can master every single activity, and you can add as needed. If you want to add functionality to it, you can do that as well. Now, before I move on, I want to quickly just talk about, well, why do I do this specific thing here where I'm pulling off of the list and then I'm putting the control point back onto the list? What this does is it allows for branches. So right now I just have a single loop, but in a more complex scenario, you may have, maybe you may have something like, and I'm not going to build it out right now, but maybe you have something like this where you have two of these pieces, right? And maybe an AGV, when he gets to this point, he may jump over to this other loop and go on this loop, and then at some point jump back onto this loop, right? So you may have two different branches. Now I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to show a very simple scenario. But if you have a branch in your loop, and I'm just going to do a very simple branch. So say I have a branch like this. Now obviously you're not going to do something this simple. This is just an example to show you. But if you have a branch like this in your loop, well, what happens with this? If I look at my entries, okay, so I'm going to go to View Entries, and you'll see that control point 9, this is control point 9, has two entries in that list. Now what happens when I pull from the list? What's going to happen is, and I'm going to actually increase my inner arrival time so that I can see them doing stuff or going down this branch with nothing to do. So let's see if we get there. Okay. So what's going to happen here is there's two entries on this list. He's going to pull one of them off and then put it back onto the end, right? What that means is the next guy who comes through, he will see this guy at the top and he'll pull that off. So what you in effect get is this kind of round robin effect, right? Because he's just swapped them out, and now control point 38 is on top. So the first guy goes there, and then the next guy who comes through, he'll go to this one, right? So he'll go to the shorter one. So this basic AGV process flow, it allows you to have branches in your loop. Now, if you wanted to, you could do, right now there's no pull query associated with this, which means it'll do this round robin effects. One guy will go one way, the next guy will go the next way. But you could always put some query in here that has some type of a balancing thing that tries to say, oh, well, which branch should I go to this time based upon some prioritization criteria. All right, that's basically the basic AGV process flow template. It's very simple. It's about as simple as it can get. The next one is AGV with work forwarding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to delete this basic AGV because, okay, that'll remove it from the model, so these guys will no longer be attached to that. But then I'm going to go into my process flow, and I'm going to add an AGV with work forwarding. Okay. And then I'm going to connect each of these AGVs up to that. So I go again, process flow, AGV, process flow, AGV. Now it kind of names them all AGV just to keep the names simple instead of this whole long name for the process flow. It names it AGV by default. Okay, so what does AGV with work forwarding do? The main thing that it does is it adds this little section right here. What this section does is it makes it so that when an AGV gets at arrives at a given control point, it can find work that is not necessarily just associated with that control point, or that is not directly at that control point. So I'm going to reconfigure my next work point loop with some work forwarding. I should say, before I do that, what's a disadvantage of this type of a next work point loop? A disadvantage is, well, if there's always an item in this queue to pick up, then the AGV will arrive here and he'll always pick up that item, and he'll never look at items in this one. So items may sit in this queue for a really, really long time, because every AGV that arrives will always arrive here first and pick up an item from this queue, right? So AGV with work forwarding will allow you to an AGV to see things, or to see work that is potentially in multiple different locations. Okay, so I'm going to disconnect my work loop, or at least reconfigure my work loop. All right, so in this case, what I'm going to do is I am going to just have 2 points on my work point loop. I'll just have it be here and here. So I make a connection from here and it'll be a next work point connection, and from here to here, and that'll be a next work point connection. So essentially I'm saying AGVs should go here and look for work, and then they should go over here and look for work, and just go back and forth between those two. Now then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a work forwarding connection from Q36 to this point. So I say work forwarding, and then I do it from there to there. And then for this queue, I'm going to do it from there to there. Now what does this mean? What this means is when an item arrives here, and this is part of this this work forwarding section, when it arrives here, instead of pushing to the partition that is associated with this control point, it's going to see that work forwarding connection, and it's going to push to the partition associated with this control point. So that when an AGV arrives at this control point, all of the items that are both for this control point and this control point will be on this AGV's partition. So that AGV will be able to see both of those items, and then he can pick and choose based upon whatever you decide as a pull query. And by default, there's no query, which will mean first in, first out. You can use a query to essentially prioritize which one he goes to load. So if I reset and run, so he missed it. So that's one of the tricky things, is he'll actually, when he first gets there, he moved on, and so he may pass it up. But when the next guy arrived here, he saw that work at that control point. Now let me actually take my inter-arrival time of my source back to a lower number so that I can get more items in. And so you'll see each one of these guys can now visualize each item. Now here's the other thing that you'll notice they kind of get stuck. And the reason is because when they get back into this loop, you'll notice he's at this control point and he doesn't have a way from getting from this control point back into the loop. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a next work point connection to that point, so it's kind of like a merging point where it merges back into the next work point loop, right? So I essentially say if I unload to here, this connection gets me back into the loop. And then I'm going to do that same thing for this guy. When I unload to this sink, I'm going to get back into the loop right there. Okay, so now if I run, they should find things to do. Okay, let's look a little bit more at this work forwarding thing. So before, you had this activity that would push to the work list, but now I'm doing a run subflow activity, which runs this whole work forwarding subflow. Now, the main thing that's happening here is you'll see there are 3 different cases that it can do. And in this case, what it's doing is it's looking at this control point and it's saying, how many work forwarding connections do you have? So there are 3 possibilities. First, there are no work forwarding connections. And in that case, if I didn't have any work forwarding connections, right, that's perfectly fine. So in that case, it just works the way it did before, which is it would push to the partition that is associated with this control point. Okay. In that case, that's fine. It's just you need to make sure that control point is part of the work point loop, right? So that AGVs will go to that control point when in looking for work. Okay. The other option is if there is one work forwarding connection. So this is the case that we see in this model for all cases, right? In this case, what it'll do is instead of pushing to this partition, it will push to this control point's partition, right? It'll essentially forward that work from this control point to this control point. The other case is, what if you have more than one work forwarding connection? And what this will do is it'll run this little subflow, and what it essentially does is it pushes to every single work point connection. So if I let me kind of get what's a good scenario for this. So what if let's just say, what if I have a connection like this? So this control point has 2 work forwarding connections, from here to here and from here to here. What that means is it will push to both partitions. So if you were to look at this partition, you'd see an item on this partition and on this partition. And then when an AGV pulls that item from a given partition, from one of those partitions, then it will automatically remove it from all of the other partitions. So that gives you some flexibility as to being really flexible as to who can see what work where. You can say for certain locations, I can have multiple, visibility for work at that location from multiple different work points, so that, you can have, it just gives you a lot of flexibility as to how you want to do it. So I'm just gonna show this. Let's see if I can have an example that might do it. So we can know that somebody was assigned to this item, right, from here if somebody travels on this little loop here. So if I do that, let's see if we can get it. Okay, so let's see, maybe he caught it. Let's see. Yeah, there he goes. So this guy was assigned to pick up this item when he was all the way over here. So it allows you a lot of flexibility as to how you know, where you want your AGVs to see what work. Okay, that's the AGV with work forwarding process flow. It adds this work forwarding mechanism. The next process flow in the progression of sophistication is AGV with basic parking. So I'm going to add that. Again, when you add it, you're going to want to go in, and I'm going to disconnect from AGV, from the original AGV one for my AGVs, and I want to reconnect with this second one that I just added, AGV2, which is that basic parking one. Okay, so what does the AGV with basic parking do? It has all of the next work point looping mechanism. It also has the work forwarding mechanism. So if I go in here, you can see that it has this work forwarding mechanism. The main thing that it adds is it adds the ability to park, which is why it's called AGV with basic parking. The other thing that it adds is it adds the ability for AGVs to load multiple items simultaneously. Okay, so the main thing, and I'm not going to go into it, I'm not going to actually do it an example, but the main thing is after you load, so you actually have a separate section for loading and unloading. After you load an item right here, then instead of just immediately jumping to unload that item, it will push that item onto a loaded items list. And then what it'll do is, if it has more capacity to load, then it'll just jump back into the main control loop. If it's filled up on capacity, then it will jump into the unload mechanism, in which case it will find the best item to unload, right? Which is, again, well, this will pull from this loaded items list, and then it'll travel to that unload point and unload, right? Okay. Yeah, so that's multi capacity. But the other thing that it adds is this parking mechanism. So in the parking, so it'll check to see if it needs to load an item. If it does not have an item to load, then it'll check if it's empty. And if it is empty, it will see if there is a parking spot. So again, I'm using this feature where I'm making these connections into lists. So this parking spots list is associated with this park points connection. Okay, so if it doesn't have something to load and it's empty, then it'll see if there's a parking spot. If there is, then it will go to that parking spot, and it will then pull from the AGV work list associated with the work point. So it'll essentially park and then wait until work arrives at the location where it's at. So let me set up this connection. So I'm going to just make this into a park point right here. So I connect this, and I say park points, and then I'm going to add a parking connection right here. Park points. Okay, and I'm going to remove this. Okay, let's run this and see how it works. So I just ran and stopped really quick. So what happened is it jumped in. It said nothing to unload here, nothing to load here. Is it empty? Yes. And it immediately jumped into this is there a parking spot, because their reset points were right here, and each of those had a parking spot. So they immediately jump into the travel to park point. Okay, and now each of them is waiting to get for an item to arrive associated with that work point. So this guy just arrived and this AGV was activated. So he goes and loads it. Now this guy is going to wait until an item arrives in that queue. Okay, when they arrive at the spots, if there's immediately something to do, then they won't go and park. It's only if there's nothing to do that they'll go and park. Right? So, a pretty basic mechanism for parking. I should say, based upon this logic, if an AGV arrives at a location and there's nothing to do and he's empty, he will always park if there are parking spots, if there are available parking spots. What that means is you have to kind of be careful about how you do your work forwarding and your park points. For example, if everybody could park, if all of your AGVs can park in one associated with one work point, then you technically need to forward your work, all of your work, at least to that work point. Because if you don't, then you could have all of your AGVs park, and then they're waiting for work to arrive at that work point. And then if work arrives at some other work point, they will not see it because it's not pushed to that partition. So you need to forward all of your work at least to that parking location where they can park. But you can, there are other ways that you could do it. You could essentially kind of have limited parking in different areas of your model. So if you have a really big model, you could say, well, there's one availability for one AGV to park in this location and one AGV to park here. And so you may, and what that does is it'll automatically kind of distribute your AGVs across your model. And then they will be naturally close to the work that naturally close to the work when it arrives. So that's another way that you could do it, is kind of distribute your AGVs across your model when they park. But it is a somewhat simplistic mechanism for parking. So the next set of AGVs, I'm not going to actually go into in this video, but I'll just kind of talk about, or at least I'm not going to build an example, I'll just talk about what they do. So AGV with heuristic parking, it adds a level of complexity to the parking mechanism. So you know how I said before, if an AGV arrives at a work point and it doesn't find something at that work point, it will always park if there is available parking. The heuristic parking will instead, it kind of keeps track of the number of total items in the system versus the number of AGV, I guess the total AGV capacity. So in general, if you just have one AGV can load one item, then that's the total AGV capacity is the total number of AGVs, of active AGVs. So it'll compare the number of active AGVs to the number of active items. And if the number of active AGVs is greater than the number of active items, then it will allow AGVs to park. If it becomes less than the number of active items, then it will try to activate AGVs from parking. Okay, so it uses this kind of heuristic. When I talk about total AGV capacity, it's the sum of the capacities of all of the AGVs in the system. So if each AGV can hold 2 items and there are 10 AGVs, then your total AGV capacity is 20. right? And so it'll compare 20, if there are 10 active AGVs, each holding, with a capacity of 2, it'll compare 20 AGV total capacity versus 20 items. And if that total capacity gets above, then AGVs can start to park. If it gets below, then AGVs will try to be activated. The other thing that the AGV heuristic parking does is it adds battery tracking. So into the main loop, it just kind of says, if I get to a certain level on my battery, then I'm going to force myself to park. Now, this is meant as just an example because it assumes that all parking locations are recharge locations. And I don't think that's true in most real scenarios. Usually you have parking locations and you have battery recharge spots, and they're different. But what you could do is you could use essentially this same logic, but maybe a different connection. So instead of a park points connection, you could add an additional connection through your AGV network. You could go in and say, I'm going to add a new connection, which it will be a control point one-way connection, and I'm going to call this recharge points, right? So you would have park points and recharge points, and your recharge points you would go to recharge points if you get below a certain battery capacity. You go to park points if you are available to park. So anyway, this one assumes that the park points connection is the same as the recharge points, right? So every parking slot is a recharge location. So you would likely want to change that if your facility implements them separately. And finally, the last one is the advanced AGV. The advanced AGV is essentially what the old process flow template was, which has all of the capabilities previously. It has heuristic parking, it has AGV work forwarding, the next work point loop, but it also adds the ability to do dynamic pickup points. So for a given location, you can have pickup points locations, and then when items arrive in that queue, it'll automatically choose an available. So if you have maybe spurs coming off of this control point, it would pick an available control point and immediately put the item into that control point, and then when AGVs come around, they will go and pick up that item from that pickup point. And then it adds also drop-off points. So if you have, for this sink, say for example, if you have this is the main location that you need to go to, but then maybe you have 3 or 4 different spurs that you can dynamically decide upon when the AGV arrives, where it says, now I need to go to this drop-off point because it's available. So you can use the drop-off points connection. So those are the different AGV process flows that will be introduced in 20.21.1. The hope is that it can give you as a user more flexibility in being able to pick and choose the feature set that you would like to use, and then branch out or implement your own logic from there, without having to kind of get the big kahuna that has all of the features in it and might be somewhat intimidating. So 21.1 should be available in April. So thanks for watching.